When purchasing a truck scale, there are many things to consider when you're planning the site layout. The site layout can affect the operations for decades, so it's important to get it right the first time. Let's first start with a few questions that you might want to ask yourself before you decide where the truck scale should be located. First of all, you want to know what is the overall goal of the weighing operation. That'll help you determine some of the location characteristics. Are you doing inbound or outbound weighing? Are you checking legal weight limits? Are you filling on the scale? How's the weight data going to be used? Do you need a scale house with an operator? These kind of questions will help guide you in determining the location of the truck scale. Once you determine why you actually need a scale, the next thing you want to think about is a typical operational day at your site. So you want to ask yourself several questions. Where will the trucks go when they arrive? Will there be a queue of trucks in either direction of the scale? Where do the trucks go after they're weighed? Is there enough room back and forth to maneuver before the scale and after the scale? You also want to consider the turning radius of the trucks. It is also important to consider some scenarios that might not happen every day. So what happens with the truck scales down for maintenance or repair? What happens if you get heavy flooding or snow? Do you have plans for site expansion? All these things need to be considered when you're actually laying out the site. Next, we want to talk about considering how much volume is going to actually go through the weighing process. So you typically want to ask, what is the volume going through your site and what are your peak seasons? This typically can be described in terms of trucks per day. If the volume's high enough, you may want to consider several scales in parallel. It typically can take 1 to 5 minutes to complete the weighing process, so you should make sure that you consider this so you don't have queues of trucks waiting to be weighed. And you also want to make sure that there's bypass lanes next to the scale in case there's other traffic that needs to get through that doesn't need to be weighed. One important thing to consider when you're deciding on a truck scale is the overall length. You don't want to decide it too short because you could potentially have longer trucks in the future. Typically you want at least a scale that's 5 to 10 feet longer than your longest truck. This will give you some tolerance for the drivers to land on the scale. In North America, the typical truck scale length is around 70 to 80 feet, and internationally it's typically 18 to 21 meters. You also need to consider the fact of having 10-foot level concrete approaches before and after the scale, so you need to take this into consideration when designing the overall layout. One of the most important things to consider when in a truck scale project is making sure you have enough space before the scale and after the scale for the trucks to adequately pull on the scale and pull off the scale without damaging things around it. So when you're figuring out the overall space that you need, the first thing to consider is the overall length of the scale that you have. So if it's typically 70 or 80 feet, you'll typically have 10 feet of flat concrete approaches before the scale and after the scale. And if the scale is above ground, you need to consider if there's ramps going down the scale or up to the scale. And typically the recommendation is 1/2 inch per foot of slope ramps going up the scale or down the scale. If the scale is in a pit, you don't have to account for this extra space. So these ramps can account for maybe 30 to 40 extra feet on both sides of the scale. And typically you want your truck to turn off of the scale once they've cleared the ramp and not before they clear the ramp. So overall, the overall space requirement could be as much as 3 to 4 times the overall length of the actual scale. The final point to consider in a truck scale layout is the overall foundation. Now the foundation, the truck scales concentrate a lot of load into several small spots where the load cells are into the foundation. So it's important to make sure the foundation is designed to adequately handle the loads. It's important to understand the soil conditions before deciding on the type of foundation. For a standard variable footer foundation, which is above ground, you typically need 2,500 pounds per square foot of soil bearing pressure in the soil. If you don't have that kind of bearing pressure, you could go with a beam slab, which only requires 1,500 pounds per square foot of soil bearing pressure. You also want to make sure there's adequate drainage in the foundation, so if it's in a pit, proper drainage or sub pumps, or if it's above ground, proper slopes away so that you don't get water and moisture underneath the foundation.